Welcome to Banyen Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyen.com. Since 1970, Banyen Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyen.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy.
Hello and welcome. My name is Jacob Steele, the events manager for Banyen Books Sound. This evening, we are delighted to host Michael Harris in conversation with J.B. MacKinnon for the launch celebration of Michael Harris's new book, All We Want, Building the Life We Cannot Buy. Michael Harris recently stopped in at the store and signed copies of All We Want. So purchasing the book from Banyen, not only will you be supporting an independent bookstore in the launch of Michael Harris's book, but you'll also receive a signed copy. The conversation and Q&A this evening will be moderated by author J.B. MacKinnon. Thus, I will introduce Mr. MacKinnon, who will then introduce Michael Harris, and then they will proceed with the conversation. J.B. MacKinnon is an award-winning journalist whose work has appeared in such publications as The New Yorker, National Geographic, and The Atlantic, as well as the Best American Science and Nature Writing anthologies. His latest book, The Day the World Stopped Shopping, is a thought experiment that imagines what a lower consuming society might look like and how it might function. Among his other books are The Once and Future World, a bestseller about rewilding the natural world, and The 100-Mile Diet with Elisa Smith, widely recognized as a catalyst of the local foods movement. JB is also an adjunct professor of journalism at the University of British Columbia, where he teaches feature writing. We are totally thrilled to welcome both of you, and I now turn it over to you, J.B. MacKinnon, to introduce author Michael Harris and commence the conversation.
Thank you, Jacob. Michael Harris, the writer we're about to hear from, the writer we're here to see tonight, he warns in his new book, All We Want, that egos and advertisements are two of our most beloved abstractions. And I have to admit, my ego was much gratified by that introduction. And it is now my pleasure to introduce Michael Harris. As most of you probably know, Michael has written two previous books, the first being The End of Absence and the other Solitude, both of which are about what we are losing as we plunge into this world of constant connection and distraction and information, and what we stand to gain in resisting that trajectory. And of course, this is a theme I'm sure we'll revisit in this conversation. Now, those books have made Michael a national best-selling author. His books are read around the world in 12 different languages. He's won the Governor General's Literary Award for nonfiction and has been shortlisted for pretty much any award you'd care to name. You've probably also read some of his shorter essays in places like the Globe and Mail, Esquire, and Wired magazine. As a thinker, Michael's been called his generation's Marshall McLuhan. And I would add only that there is one key difference. I'm sure many of the people here tonight have read Marshall McLuhan and recognize that clarity is not McLuhan's bag. Michael, on the other hand, writes with a beauty and a crystalline clarity that is uniquely his own. Michael, congratulations on this new book, All We Want.
Thanks, James. I thought you were going to say the one difference between me and McLuhan is that people had read McLuhan. So I'm glad that you.
Actually, I think quite the contrary. Isn't he famously one of these books that is on the shelf but nobody's quite finished? But
I think I have
except
a
for
couple
you,
of them
I believe
here,
that you've read it. I feel like introductions these days often reduce us to our work, to our productive capacities. And that doesn't seem fitting with the themes of your book or even with mine. What's something you do or you care about in the time that you're not spending pondering the great moral questions of our times?
I mean, right now I'm sort of weirdly obsessed with my dog. I think through the kind of the mania of book launch, my dog does not care about the book. My dog will never buy the book. So in between interviews and things, I'm just sort of going up and having little mini therapy sessions with Murphy the golden doodle. So yeah, that's my world right now.
Murphy the golden doodle.
Murphy the golden doodle, and then also my husband, who's been giving sort of writer therapy sessions. Yeah.
The golden doodle, instant connection to the sublime, in a sense.
Yeah.
I remember when I first heard that you were working on this book, and it was a bit of a different creature than what the book became. Can you tell us a little bit about that transformation?
Yeah. I mean, the book began from, I think, a much more narrow and like almost selfish focus, right? It was like I grew up in the 1980s in a world where the expectation was you're going to have more than your parents had, and your parents are going to have more than their parents had, right? And so then when I became an adult and realized I was going to actually have less than my parents, and that there was a whole generation that was kind of having this sort of bitter experience of realizing that the jig was up, and you know, we weren't going to be able to have infinite growth. I came to a kind of, I think, a bitterness that I wanted to write about. I wanted to write about, like, what does it mean to be the first generation to have less? And it was only really when I was maybe halfway into working on this book that I realized this isn't a generational argument that I'm making. It's really an argument about how we all live. Yeah, so it became hopefully a little bit less bitter, a little bit less microcosmic, and expanded into something for everybody.
When did you first realize that the book was moving along this new path, or was there some kind of trigger where you know, kind of a eureka moment where you thought, well, no, this book is not, the book I'm writing is not the book that I want to write?
You know, like so many COVID authors, I think it was in the middle of the pandemic. You know, like it shook a lot of things up for a lot of people. And I was partway through working on this book. We were trying to, my husband and I were trying to do some kind of budget renovations on a townhouse that we had just bought. So we were kind of enmeshed in our own, you know, capitalist drama. And while those renos were going on, we were living at my parents' house. And that had its own drama as well for like 4 months living with my parents. And we were trying to take care of Kenny's mother, who had dementia, has dementia. So there were just bigger things swirling around us, I guess. And, you know, and there was a pandemic on top of all that. So we were trying, I guess just the scope of things expanded while I was working. And I felt I had to react to that.
It's interesting. Right now, I mean, within the pandemic is obviously a crisis in itself. The other big crisis that we're all facing is this climate crisis. And it seems as though, you know, most of the writing and most of the thinking these days is around how do you specific ways that we might reduce carbon emissions to slow climate change. And there, you know, there's so much sort of thought and effort moving in that direction. You settled instead on talking about what you call the consumer story. How did that become the focus?
I mean, maybe I read too much Joan Didion or something, but I really believe in this idea that we live by stories, right? And so for me, when I started thinking about consumer culture, I'm not an economist. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not an ecologist. I'm just very much a generalist. And so when I turned to this subject, it was about stories that we live by. And that's how I was thinking about it, is just the narratives of our time. So it became about, this was the story, this monomyth that had consumed all other modes of being, it seems to me. And so I wanted to understand first and foremost how that story came to be, how, like all stories, it's written by someone, right? So it was about the invention of that story. And then secondly, it was about, what are the ways out after you finish that story? What are the other stories on the bookshelf?
Now, I mean, you describe it as though it were the natural story, that obvious story, maybe even to tell. And yet this consumer story really hasn't been at the heart of public discussion for about 25 years, right? I mean, it was the mid-1990s was the last time that I recall there being, a very broad public conversation about consumption itself and overconsumption and consumerism. How do you approach a topic like that? I mean, if you're talking about the thing that everybody else is talking about, then you can write a book that bites off a little piece of that and explores it really deeply. But in this case, you're kind of dragging the whole, the whole thing out into the spotlight.
Yeah, I mean, with all my books, I've been interested in looking at the deep history of things that we're living with now, things that seem new. I don't believe that they are new, right? There's always these factors that have formed our moment. Like I'm a big believer in this idea of history as a wave, and we're just sort of living on the edge of it, right? That we're just these drops at the top of the wave, and we think we are the wave, but there's so much behind it, right? So whether I'm writing about the internet or about solitude, or in this case about consumer culture, my instinct is to go back in time and try to understand it. So it was always going to be about cultural history. In this case, as you know, consumer culture, you can map it back centuries if you like, but the manic level of consumer culture that I was interested in was one that began around the 1920s. So I sort of hemmed myself in to about a century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the first part of the book is this exploration of the consumer story and how it developed. And you talk about who created it, in a sense, who wrote it, right? I mean, the advertising industry, the advocates for perpetual economic growth, publicists and lobbyists, and you name names in this. And
yeah, well, I mean,
I
was just going to say, like in particular, Edward Bernays is the name that I name. He's a bit of a straw man, or like he's like a totem for a larger cultural shift. But yeah, he's a fascinating figure because he was literally a war propagandist who discovered that propaganda could be used in times of peace. And in his case, he went to work for a lot of different companies, but I focus on his work for American Tobacco. And he was using the same kinds of techniques that are used today when you go on Instagram and there's an influencer whose lifestyle you're supposed to admire, and they're wearing these shoes or that shirt, and then there's a link so that you can buy it. Edward Bernays was doing that 100 years ago by taking debutantes in New York and giving them cigarettes and having them walk down streets. Journalists would photograph them because it was risque for women to be smoking in public, and Bernays would kind of whisper to those journalists, you know, those aren't cigarettes they're smoking, those are torches of freedom. And so he knew that you could marry a product to an ideology. And that was the missing thing when industrialization had kind of taken off and suddenly you had more things than people really needed. You had to invent desire. There had to be kind of a calculus of desire. So that the fact that that was going on 100 years ago, and we're still basically doing that on Instagram today, was super fascinating to me.
Yeah, and I'm thinking too about the fact that Torstein Veblen wrote, he came up with the term conspicuous consumption only, what, 20, a couple of decades before Bernays. And yet, when I was reading through Theory of the Leisure Class for research for my own book, he doesn't mention advertising in that book. The only time he uses the term advertising is in the sort of, you know, like, I wanted to advertise to a friend of mine that I was going to come to his house for dinner, you know, and yet there's this incredible transformation that happens just a couple of decades later. Now, despite the fact that you name names and you point to these powerful forces, I mean, for a time, as I read the book, I thought that you were going to say, what we need to do is tear down those powerful forces, but you take a different turn. What's the reasoning behind that?
So yeah, about halfway through the book, I think it's pretty well established to that point that there is this overwhelming narrative that isn't about to be dismantled. So like tearing down the narrative doesn't feel like an option. What does feel like an option is on a personal level, expanding your life, diving into a richer interior life or a richer experiential life. So I kind of pivot and maybe put the onus on the reader a little bit more. But my hope is that in exploring other ways of being outside of consumer culture, that also convinces us to vote for systemic change, right? So I think that's where the big change happens, actually, is when hearts and minds have been altered to the point where a whole generation starts demanding the kinds of systemic change that corporations and propagandists like MBAs are not going to make on their own.
I want to read one quote to you from the book. I mean, there's a lot of wonderful read it out loud to whoever's sitting next to you on the SkyTrain kind of lines in this book. But at one point you write, "The only society that can be bought into being is a society of consumers." Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds kind of like I'm borrowing from, I think it's Audre Lorde, right? She says something like the master's tools will not dismantle the master's machine. I'm paraphrasing badly, but I guess that's what it comes down to, that you cannot fix a problem with the problem. That there is this need for some kind of wholesale paradigm shift. The same thing happened I remember in my thinking around The End of Absence, my first book, there's a lot of technological solutionism, a lot of apps that are going to make you stop using apps, and bits on your phone that are supposed to help you manage your social media usage, right? And I sort of I kind of call bullshit on a lot of that stuff in that book. And in this book, it was a similar thing. The idea that we're going to buy green products and that will be the answer, you know, that written within consumer culture is the solution to consumer culture. It just did not hold water. That, you know, and I mean, and this gets into you know, something you and I have talked about before, which is the Jevons paradox, right? That if you create supposedly green, well, they are green, but yeah, quote unquote green technologies that are supposed to save on energy efficiency, what happens? People just start using more of that thing. So you make more efficient refrigerators, and refrigerators double in size. And you've written about how LED bulbs just led to more light usage, all this stuff. So it just seemed to me that you can't just change the kinds of things that we're buying. You have to actually change the way that we measure our lives.
Yeah, and it's been about 20 years though that this idea of green consumerism, that we can simply wave away the consequences of our consumption through making our consumption biodegradable and circular and solar powered and energy efficient and so on. I mean, that has been the dominant narrative for 2 decades now. Do you feel, I mean, obviously you and I both felt that it might be time to start talking about the sheer scale and the consumer story, the consumer mentality. Do you feel like that is that's in the air again, and if so, why?
I think the idea of buying your way out of the problem by changing the kinds of things, it feels sort of like a Mardi Gras, right? Like, oh, the people are upset, give them like an idea of revolution, but it won't be a real revolution. That's sort of how I feel about a single-minded approach to green growth or to electric vehicles or whatever. Obviously, these things are useful, but I do feel that people, I mean, I think people are becoming more comfortable with the idea of radical change. Certainly, I don't, I am like a sort of waspy person in origin. That's the world that I grew up in. And so for me to feel that there are dramatic changes necessary is saying something. And I say this from a place where I'm not thinking of myself as like a major radical. I know I'm not doing nearly my share, but I do think that dinner tables, ordinary conversations with friends are slowly becoming more open to that kind of massive change. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk about the sort of change that you're proposing here. And you note, and I think we're all familiar with this idea, that the great promise of the consumer story is happiness, that it's always one product purchase away or one consumer experience over the horizon. You introduce Aristotle's idea of eudaimonia as an alternative. Can you talk a bit about how that's been interpreted and kind of the understanding of it that you settled on?
Yeah, so often you'll see eudaimonia being defined as happiness, which I think is very telling, because that's what we think well-being must be, that it must be just, a sense of pleasure or satisfaction. But that's not, it turns out, what Aristotle meant. He was talking about human flourishing. He was talking about becoming really the best version of yourself. And that does not necessarily mean being happy all the time. It seems to me that there's a kind of poverty of experience there in consumer culture, in that it's only offering you this little kind of corner of experience. Be happy, be happy. And so once I became more interested in Aristotle's idea of eudaimonia, this opens up this idea of experience, of flourishing, of rather than getting a thing that makes you happy, it's more about doing the thing that makes you you. That's maybe the tightest way I can say it. And so the second half of the book is sort of a search for those modes of being, those other ways to measure your life. So there's a chapter on craft, there's a chapter on the sublime, and then there's a chapter on care, on taking care of people. And these are all in a way kind of antidotes to consumer culture, I think.
Right, and it's kind of an exciting moment in the book, because I think you even say that you were
Do I
going
say it's
through.
exciting?
No, you don't say that, but you say, you were going through, you're tracing the consumer story, and you became impatient with that, and you had this desire to kind of break and in a different direction towards an alternative, and it has this. It really feels like a break, like you burst out in this other direction.
Yeah, and that, thank you for noticing that, because that's very much by design. The book is basically broken into two halves, and it starts off in a fairly kind of nonfiction conventional way. It's sort of going through the history of the consumer story and how it was built, and hopefully it's interesting, but there is a kind of rupture moment halfway through the book where we do I guess I'm impatient, and I want those other stories. And not only does the subject change, but the tone and the way that the book is written actually begins to change. And the idea there was that content and form would sort of become melded, right? And so by the end of the book, it's actually basically a memoir. And so it's become more humane in keeping with the kind of moral argument that the book is trying to make.
Mm-hmm. So you, as you said, you've got these three themes. I think in one of the interpretations of eudaimonia, you refer to them as activities of the soul, craft, the sublime, and care. One of these, craft, the first one that you explore, you actually built into the process of producing the book. You wrote this book by hand.
Yeah.
What did that teach you about the idea of craft?
So I think sometimes making things more difficult is actually important, like building labor into a process. And so that's what that was about for me. I mean, part of our digital economy is that it makes everything easy, that we can buy things with a click on Amazon, right? And when you're writing on a laptop, there's a similar amount of ease. Words come and go so easily. And so I wanted to become more, I guess, invested in the material reality of the book. And it was sort of a way of reminding myself that one of the themes in the book is that we need to respect the material world, and that if we were more invested in craft, we would become less likely to disregard the material world that supports us all.
Mm-hmm. The sublime. This is this strange feeling of awe and wonder and mystery and humility that we often experience in nature, or that we can experience in nature. This one I think might be harder for people to understand than the other two, in terms of how does the sublime act as a counterpoint to the consumer story?
I mean, I think what it does is it makes your smaller consumerist concerns, it puts them in their place, right? I think we've all had the experience of being obsessed with things that don't really matter, like buying the right kind of wine, or getting the right kind of car, or looking good at a party or something. And then you walk out into the night and you look up at the stars, and you can have a moment of things washing over you, and all of your petty all your petty concerns are put into focus. And I think that's what the sublime does for you. Is it's actually two things. It allows you to worry less about things that don't matter, but it also connects you to something infinite and something actually really grand, this kind of larger clockwork of the universe, right? And so it gives you something to fall in love with other than consumer culture. So I think it does help a lot. And so in the book, I was kind of experiencing that while Kenny and I were hiking around Lake Louise.
It struck me too, though, that going into the natural world has in a way been drawn into the consumer story as well. That I remember talking to the conservation biologist Michael Soule, and he had kind of broken down the experiences we can have into nature into, I don't know, 7 different types or something. But one of them was the playground, and another was the gymnasium. When we go into the natural world, we're not always going to church, right? And you can pay umpteen dollars to fly in and witness the Northern Lights.
Oh, totally. Like, but when Kenny and I went to Lake Louise, we had to park like an hour's walk down the road because 1 million people come to Lake Louise every year, right? So, and that's very much it is fraught, and this is something that's in the book constantly too. That the back to that idea of you can't dismantle consumer culture. It's always going to be there, and so even within a search for craft or the sublime or care or whatever, even within all these efforts, we still live in the world we live in, and so we kind of, I guess we grasp at new options where we can, but we are forever being chased by that monomyth.
You just touched on something a minute ago that I wanted. To be honest, I didn't really know. The third activity of the soul is care, and in one sense, it's such a rich chapter that I almost don't want to give it away. At the same time, I don't really know what to ask you about it either. I mean, it's about sort of plunging into the world of Kenny's mother and her dementia and your participation in that. As you know, my mother has dementia. I can buy into the idea that there is something deeply valuable with engaging with that thing that is such a dread horror to so many people. What I guess the way I ended up wrapping my head around it is that so much of what you write about is the value of doing things the hard way, in a sense, right? Of going to the uncomfortable, spending time with yourself, sitting alone with your thoughts, confronting mortality and the puniness of the human being and the sublime, and finding meaning in caring for our aging parents. I mean, why is that set of ideas become so important to you?
I mean, the care chapter, it's about being drawn into this like larger network of human concern, right? That again, that happiness and feeling good is not the only point of our lives, right? And a whole generation is about to discover that, right? The baby boomers are going to become the gray boom, and they're going to be moving into long-term care homes, and dementia is going to be very much part of our lives over the next 20 years. And I think, in a world that is constantly asking or constantly encouraging us to ask, what can I get? When your mom gets sick, it is at last an opportunity to say, like, what can I give? What do I have to give? And as hard as that is, I know from watching Kenny, and Kenny's actually told me that it radically changed him and changed his set of priorities, and my own by proxy, just by being part of this experience. I think it's probably akin to what a mother feels in taking care of a child, and how everything that they thought that mattered doesn't matter in the same way, because there's something very primal that gets called up, right? It doesn't get called up very often in our lives, but when it does get called up, that need that somebody else has for us to just be there for them instead of what can we get out of it, it's changing you on a cellular level, I think.
But then, of course, you have to answer the call, and so some choose instead to vanish even further into consumer distraction. This might get to one of the questions that's come in from Carol. How did these three antidotes to consumer culture present themselves to you? I mean, how did they evolve for you? And she's asking, I think, especially, she says, care especially seems like an unexpected antidote.
Yeah, I mean, so craft and the sublime were actually things that that I imagined I wanted to pursue. Care was an antidote that was thrust upon me by the experience of Kenny's mother getting sick. And I think that's, that's the way it had to be. It was like moving into that kind of selflessness is not something that anybody volunteers to do. Really, you find yourself in a position where you can't help but give of yourself because your soul is calling you to do it, or just familial obligation is calling you to do it. And it's only when you're then a year into that emotional labor that you realize that it has changed you, A, and B, that it has changed you for the better. So I'm not sure to what degree I'm answering her question, but I think that, care, that final antidote, was something that happened to me as opposed to something I figured out.
I'm going to move into some more of the questions. And there's one from Matt. Global consumption has largely been driven by so-called first world countries. And now with the push to net zero, these countries are trying to reverse course, at least make it more expensive to consume certain things that are destructive to our planet through carbon taxes, etc. But in both building up and tearing down, it seems like wealthy corners of the world and society, less wealthy corners of the world and society haven't been part of the discussion. How do we change that? Or is it naive to believe that it's even possible?
Yeah, I mean, billions of people around the world are going to enter the middle class over the next couple decades. And those billions are not going to be consumer angels that immediately jump to our ideas about what recycling looks like or what energy consumption should look like. They're going to want to be part of that consumer party. And I'm not an economist, but I'm pretty sure that they're going to be people. They're going to be humans acting like humans. And so when that development happens, it probably is going to require a lot of, well, I was going to say international agreement, but that's a bit of a pipe dream. I would imagine it's got to be less about censure of developing countries and more about offering aid in the form of helping them get toward like lower consumption lifestyles or more efficient energy usage.
This is a question that I'm quite curious about as well. Did you explore or consider other categories besides the three and decide not to go with them?
That's a good question. And the answer is no. I felt very aware that there were other categories that would be out there for other people. But yeah, these were the three that came to me. And I don't think it's not prescriptive, right? It's not that these are the three that are going to be everybody's exit door. They were just the three that mattered the most to me.
Nothing else just tickled your fancy for even a moment?
The Sublime was a section of the book where I briefly considered something more explicitly spiritual. I'm a pretty staunch atheist myself, but at one point I was considering going to a Buddhist monastery and trying to tackle it from that angle. But I think it felt too much like an angle is what it came down to, and I didn't want to study Buddhists as like an anthropologist or something. I wanted to focus on something that was more easily accessible, and to me that meant just the natural world around us.
Did any of these reveal themselves more gradually than the others?
Well, care definitely was more gradual, right? We've been working or helping Kenny's mom for something like 3 years now, and so that's been something that kind of crept up on us, of course. The craft chapter actually came about like really suddenly and weirdly. I was like cruising through YouTube and suddenly saw a video of this guy, Don Gardner, who was, it had like 30 views and was like just a guy working on a birch bark canoe. And I don't know what mindset I was in that day, but I became obsessed with this video of this kind of Tolkien-esque figure in a shack in Alberta, talking about this work that he loved so much that just felt totally divorced from the world that I was in. So I ended up going and finding him in Alberta in his little shack in his workshop, and spent time with him while he was making a canoe and while he was carving bow and arrows. And I just became massively envious of his state of being, that he was so centered and I guess he had a sense of safety in himself because he knew what his job was. He knew what he wanted to do. He had mastery over his craft and such an intimate relationship with the materials that he worked with. And that just seemed like a 180 from what I do as a writer, where everything is quite abstract and it's very hard to hold on to any of it. Yeah. So anyway, that's how I came to craft, is I just sort of fell in love with this one craftsperson.
You promptly went home and hewed yourself a pencil and beat some paper out of rags. And that's how I'm picturing it, Michael, and don't tell me otherwise. I better get back to some questions here. So a couple from Fiona, I'll do them in order here. Do you see the guaranteed annual income as a way to valorize unpaid caregiving for family? And I suppose embedded in this question is, can we support care better as a society than we are right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for that. I have become a huge admirer of professional caregivers and unprofessional caregivers over the last couple of years, watching Kenny's mom at her care home, and also friends of ours that work in hospitals during COVID, right? These are obviously highly underappreciated people. The question is about, is it basically a UBI question? Is this?
I think so. Guaranteed annual income.
Guaranteed annual income for caregivers. I think that could be wonderful. I don't know that down the road we need to even stop there. Again, not an economist, very much a generalist. So I'm very much getting in the weeds here, but I can imagine a world where enough wealth is created by our machines and our AI that a great deal of the population is kind of weeded out of the workforce. And I don't think that that needs to be shameful. What would be shameful is a population that has no paid work and no occupation, by which I mean nothing to do with their time, right? So we don't want a kind of Wall-E situation where everybody's just watching Netflix all day. And that's where that craft chapter takes us to, is into the value of labor, irregardless of whether you're getting a paycheck for it or not.
Another question from Fiona. How do we deal with the fear-mongering about shrinking economic growth? If we all are crafting and subliming and caring,
it's going to hurt the economy.
It's going to hurt the economy, Michael. What are you going to do about that?
I mean, this is more a question for James than it is for me, because he goes into this in depth in his book. But it does seem to me that it isn't an option between whether we change or not. It's an option about whether we forestall disaster or not. So the alternative to growth is not no growth. The alternative to growth is fewer. How am I going to put this? The choice isn't between growing our economy or not growing our economy. The choice is between having a climate disaster or having a worse climate disaster. And yeah, the option isn't really there to not do anything. We'll either do it before the disaster or after.
Got a question here from Andrew. This is a question that I actually encountered in my own research as well. I mean, it's quite a serious issue for people who are contemplating whether to turn away from mainstream consumer culture and consumerism. So Andrew saying, as an adult, he's grappled with this question of separating from others to live more soulfully and consciously, and alternatively, staying engaged with material society, trying to convince others to live differently and be more aware of the impact of their individual obsessions. Does this have to be a clear-cut decision, and in effect, a choice we need to confront?
Can you read the second part of that question one more time? I'm just trying to grapple with it.
Does this have to be a clear-cut decision, I think, between staying engaged with material society and trying to convince others to live differently, or turning away from mainstream consumer culture and consumerism, separating yourself from others to live more soulfully and consciously? Does this have to be a clear-cut decision? In effect, a choice we need to confront.
Yeah, I mean, to my mind, this is not. I mean, I've heard you, James, talk about purity tests and how doesn't need to be there. I don't think that a failure to go off and become a hermit is some kind of personal failing. I think what the goal ought to be is that enough people take these issues seriously so that our voting patterns lead to politicians that are going to value human life and the planet over GDP, or politicians that are going to create policies to save us from planned obsolescence, or politicians that are going to lower wealth inequality. So, I think that's the big goal, not a whole bunch of people simultaneously having epiphanies and suddenly walking away from the consumer story. Because as we were discussing earlier, you can't get out from under the zeitgeist. Really, it's in your blood.
Arno asks, did writing this book change the way you live your life or want to live your life in any way? Like, have you taken up a craft? besides writing?
Besides writing a book, Arno? You know, I don't know that people write books in order to change themselves. I think people write books in order to find out what they think. And I don't know, writing books has never changed me in a dramatic way. It's changed me in a neurotic way, I think. The big change in my life, having written this book, is that every consumer choice in my household is now fraught. So Kenny decided he wanted to be able to shave his beard more easily, and he didn't like the clippers that I have. And so this has been now a discussion for a week, whether or not we should buy new clippers and which clippers are going to be durable so that we don't have to buy them again in a year. And can't he use my clippers even though they don't get his mustache properly? So yeah, basically it's just caused a bunch of marital strife is I guess the biggest change.
Relatedly, Carol asking, do you feel as if your forays into craft, the sublime, and care brought you any closer to Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia? Do you believe there's hope or possibility for us as humans to find solace in our own flourishing as an alternative to consumption?
Well, yeah, so that is related. I feel like you know what it's done is it's given me permission to enjoy little moments of eudaimonia, little moments of flourishing. You know, I had a bunch of interviews I had to do earlier today, and you know, ultimately that was business, that was work, and then I had like 3 hours before I came in to have this conversation, and I went out on a long walk down by the ocean, and I think even just giving myself permission to detach from my work in the middle of a busy day is something that maybe I wouldn't have done 2 years ago. So just the valuing of that, the permission to value things outside of my work is something that has been a change.
A question from me. While I was researching my book, I encountered this work by a sociologist named Stephen Zavostovsky. And so he looked at what consumer culture was good at and bad at in terms of feeding our human needs. And he did this back in the 1990s. And he found that it was good at feeding some pretty important needs. But one thing it was terrible at was authenticity. That it really could not deliver a sense of authenticity to people. Now, his response to that was not fantastic. Authenticity is the path forward. His response was, I'm betting that consumer culture is going to get a lot better at selling the idea of authenticity. 10 years later, authenticity was so heavily used in marketing that even marketers were describing it as overused. I wonder if are you concerned that these kinds of ideas, craft, the sublime, and care, can these be co-opted and sold back to us by consumer culture? And if so, is there any way we can co-opt proof them?
It's already too late. They've already been co-opted.
You can get a birch bark canoe kit?
You can get a birch bark, sure you can.
Yeah, you probably can.
I mean, craft, if you look, I mean, craft has become something cute to post on Instagram. The sublime, as we were discussing before, is a tourism trap. Care is self-care. I'm going to go to the spa. I'm going to buy this special seaweed scrub for my feet, right? That's one of the points of the book, that nothing is safe, right? That you will not dismantle consumer culture. It is a tide of history that comes when it wants to come and then leaves at some point in the future when it wants to leave. So raging against that particular machine is probably going to be ineffectual. And yeah, to your point, we do need to, when we're seeking our exit strategies, we have to be a little bit cynical about it, right? To make sure that this isn't a false authenticity, another sort of trapdoor back into the consumer story. It's that trick is always there. That doesn't mean there's no such thing as an authentic life. It doesn't mean that you can't have an authentic experience of care or craft or the sublime, but you have to be honest with yourself. And I think the merchandising of the self through social media is actually one of the easiest ways to find out whether that has happened, whether that trick has happened. So if you're doing something and your first instinct is to talk about it on Twitter, that experience is probably being co-opted by your consumer instincts, right? So I think we should see that instinct as a red flag when you want to take a picture of that loaf of bread that you just baked.
Also makes it really difficult to market a book about deconsumerism through social media, which is what
which is what I am very much doing on Twitter right now. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, my one bit of solace there is I feel like the world has a lot of things wrong with it, but people reading too much is not one of them, and so I'm okay with people buying books.
A question from Andrew. As well as Aristotle, can we be informed by indigenous wisdom and values as touchstones and drivers for the kind of change we need?
Yeah, I imagine we can. I think there's always a danger in imagining there's only one kind of indigenous wisdom. I think we've seen, in forest politics in British Columbia, that not all indigenous people or indigenous groups have the same politics or the same philosophies. So you have to be a little bit careful about what you're talking about there. But yeah, Aristotle, dead white, he's not white, but dead man from a long time ago in the Western canon. We don't need to rely on the Western canon for wisdom. They're one source that came easily and kind of obviously to me. And if I had the book to write over, I may well have looked for that eudaimonia idea in another well.
Kim asks, given how integral the internet is to consumerism, how can it be integral to craft, sublime, and care?
I don't know that it needs to be. I mean, there's nothing. Melvin Kranzberg had this kind of famous line that I like. He said, technology is neither good nor evil, but neither is it neutral, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with using digital technology. We're using it right now to connect and talk about these ideas. But you have, just like a knife in your kitchen, you have to be aware that it's a tool, and it is an extension, to use a McLuhanism, it's an extension of your will. And so what are you using it for becomes the question. I totally believe that we can use the internet or digital technologies to expand our understanding of craft, sublime, and care. We just would have to be careful about it. And it's probably easier, at least when we're starting out, to explore these things with fewer mediating forces so that things are a bit more focused. That said, I'm reminded there was a part in the book that I took out where I went to Raleigh in the States and hung out with a bunch of coders for a long time. And this was actually in the craft book. And I was talking about coding as a form of craft, which is an idea I got actually from Richard Sennett. And these were people working on laptops, but they had the same passion and the same interest in the kind of the truths underlying underneath a superficial reality, which is that code. So they too, I think, are craftspeople. But I think it's easier to talk about these things sometimes when we step away from our screens.
And from Fiona, could Michael talk about how his book deals with the perspective of social class? For example, professional craftspeople are too often poorly paid, musicians, carpenters, and often paid by wealthy people of leisure.
Yeah, I mean, class probably should have been in the book more than it is. The book is brief, and so it's a bit of a whirlwind. I would just note that all three of these like quote unquote antidotes, craft, the sublime, and care, I was saying before, they've already been co-opted to a certain degree by consumer culture. I think we're encouraged to think that only a certain class of person has access to some of those things, right? And it's not true. Whether you're being paid to do it or not, we all have. These are fundamental human interests that we all can become engaged by. And yeah, I mean, similar to that question about caregivers and UBI, in a future of greater automation, I would not at all be surprised if we found a more humane way of dealing with craftspeople outside of the sort of the industrial complex, and found more humane ways of supporting them.
We're running slightly over time at this point, so I'm going to hit you with a final question from me.
Okay.
And it is the hope question.
Oh no, the hardest one.
But I'm gonna ask it in a very specific way. So I'm going to define optimism as meaning that you see patterns emerging that give you reason to believe that we're beginning to turn away from the consumer story. Okay, you actually see patterns emerging. And I'm going to define hope as meaning that you do not see patterns emerging that give you reason to believe we're beginning to turn away from the consumer story, but you still believe those patterns could emerge. By these definitions, are you an optimist? Are you hopeful? Are you none of the above?
Wait, give them to me one more time. Optimism and hope.
Optimism means you see patterns emerging. Optimism means that you see patterns emerging that give you reason to believe we are beginning to turn away from the consumer story.
Okay.
And in this case, I'm saying hope means you do not see patterns emerging right now that give you reason to believe we're beginning to turn away from the consumer story, but you believe those patterns could emerge soon. Optimist, hopeful?
I think I'm hopeful. I think there's an idea in physics called an existence proof. And this is something when a physicist witnesses something happening with a bunch of particles, they don't know how it happened, but they know it can happen. That's called an existence proof, because the proof is that it existed. And I think what we've gone through with the early stages of the pandemic was an existence proof of change. It's possible. We don't know how to do that without a viral epidemic, but we know it can be done. We know that we can change, and that our climate will it will have a healthy reaction to those changes. So that's what I believe in. I believe that we have already had an existence proof, and that I'm hopeful that we can figure out how the mechanics of this can work down the road.
That's terrific. Thanks so much, Michael. And I do just want to say, I mean, it is a fantastic book. As Michael says, it's brief. You can you can fit this in anywhere. And I also want to say, I know from my own experience that people are sometimes hesitant to buy a book about that questions consumption. But I am going to encourage you to buy this book. And the reason is that in this crazy consumer system that we live in, if you support the message of a book, the most powerful way that you can support that message is to buy the book. And unfortunately, that's the most powerful amplifier we have of a book's voice. So please don't hesitate to buy this book. You will absolutely enjoy reading it and pass it into others' hands, and you can certainly feel free to do that. But yeah, I really encourage you to support the book, and of course, you'll enjoy the book. Thanks so much, Michael, and I will throw it back to Jacob from Banyen, who I think has a couple of parting words for us. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I'd also just like to thank you very much for this very enjoyable event, and it was very thought-provoking. It's an important book and highly recommended. A reminder to all that you can purchase a signed copy of All I Want, Building the Life We Cannot Buy from Banyen Books in person or online at banyen.com. And find out more about Michael Harris at michaeljohnharris.com and about JB MacKinnon at jbmackinnon.com. Thanks again to both of you and to all of you who have joined today. Till next time.
Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom, a podcast of Banyen Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. The show is edited by Abdo Habani. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyen Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyen.com.